The phone call came at 3 a.m., the kind that rattles you awake from a dreamless sleep, making you question whether your heart is racing because of the urgency in the voice or the weight of the words that follow. It was Marcus, my cousin. We've been close since childhood, bound by blood and the years we'd spent together at family gatherings, holidays, and lazy Sunday afternoons. But tonight, it wasn't the casual, "Hey, what's up?" I was used to. His voice was sharp, breaking through the silence of my room, raw and panicked. You need to come over. It's Mom." He choked on the words and there was a pause, one that made my chest tighten. Without another thought, I was out the door and speeding through the streets, my mind spiraling. What had happened to his mother, my aunt, who had been like a second mom to me? The only thing louder than my thumping heart was the sinking feeling in my stomach. As I arrived, I was ushered inside with no time to question anything further, a sense of urgency pulling me into the chaos of the house. I barely had time to process the soft sobbing coming from Marcus before I was hit with the shocking news. His mother, my aunt, had collapsed, and the doctors were calling it an emergency that no one had seen coming. She was stable now, but they couldn't promise anything. It was the kind of moment that shakes your entire world. But what happened next, something I never saw coming, was that while everyone in the house was focused on Aunt Carol's health, I couldn't stop noticing something else. The way Marcus was standing there, holding himself together, but his eyes were different. There was a heaviness in them that I'd never seen before. The once cousin, always family bond suddenly felt uncertain, like the ground beneath us had shifted. And in that moment, as I stood in the hallway staring at Marcus from across the room, a thought flickered through my mind, uninvited but undeniable. What if everything I thought I knew about us was about to change forever? The hours stretched on in that tense, hospital-lit waiting room. Aunt Carol was still in surgery, and the rest of the family was doing what they do best, keeping busy with small talk and idle chatter, masking their anxiety. But Marcus and I didn't speak much. He seemed lost in his own world, distant yet close, as if the space between us had suddenly become charged with something we couldn't acknowledge. I watched him carefully as he moved about, pacing and then sitting down, only to stand up again moments later. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a silent cry for help that I couldn't reach, and yet my heart felt like it was being pulled in his direction. Something shifted in me, something that had been there all along but had gone unnoticed, a subtle, unsettling attraction. My mind couldn't wrap around it. This wasn't supposed to be my reality, not now, not after all these years of seeing him as family. But the truth was, the more I tried to push the thought away, the more it crept back into my consciousness. We had been through so much together. As kids, we'd played pranks, shared secrets, laughed at inside jokes that no one else understood. We were supposed to be a unit, a family unit that was bound by nothing but loyalty and love. And yet, there was this tension now, an electric pull I couldn't ignore. It was absurd. It was wrong. But when Marcus finally sat down beside me on the couch, his usual place, the spot where we'd always talked about life, love, and everything in between, he didn't speak. His leg brushed against mine, a small, accidental touch that jolted my body, making my pulse quicken in a way I hadn't expected. I looked at him, expecting to see the same cousin who'd shared his childhood with me, but instead, I found myself staring into his eyes, suddenly realizing how much I had never truly seen him before. And just like that, Without any warning, the world I'd built around my feelings for him shattered. What was once familiar was now foreign, and what was once simple was now complicated in ways I couldn't begin to understand. The night dragged on, and the coldness of the hospital waiting room seemed to seep into my bones, making it hard to breathe. Aunt Carol was still in surgery, and the silence between Marcus and me was thick, like a storm just waiting to break. My mind was spinning with 1,000 conflicting thoughts, but one thing kept rising above them all. What was happening to me? Why was I feeling this pull toward Marcus, this undeniable connection that felt so wrong and yet so intense? The longer I sat there next to him, the harder it became to ignore the shifting dynamic between us. Finally, Marcus broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid to speak too loudly in case the words would shatter everything. "I don't know what to do, Em," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I feel like I'm losing everything, like I'm losing her." His pain was palpable, and instinctively, I reached out to touch his arm, offering what little comfort I could. But as my hand rested there, something unexpected happened. His hand covered mine. The touch was soft, hesitant at first, as if he was unsure whether to let it linger or pull away. I didn't pull back. Neither of us did. In that moment, something inside me cracked open, and I realized that this wasn't just about Aunt Carol anymore. It wasn't even about the emergency that had brought us here. It was about us, about what we had always been, what we had been hiding, and what we had been too afraid to confront. The air between us thickened, charged with an energy I couldn't explain, and suddenly, the line between family and something more blurred beyond recognition. He turned his face toward mine, his eyes searching as though he was reading the unsaid words hanging between us. It felt like the ground beneath us was shifting, turning into something unfamiliar, something we couldn't control. I wanted to pull back, to apologize, to make it stop before it went too far. But instead, I found myself leaning in closer, unable to resist the pull. His breath was shaky as he whispered, "I don't know what's happening, but I can't pretend anymore, Em. I need you." Those words hit me harder than any physical blow could. They were honest, raw, and unfiltered, the kind of words that could undo everything we'd ever known. I froze, unsure whether I should run or face the reality of what he was saying. But there was no running from this. Not anymore. The world around us, the chaos of the hospital, faded away until it was just the two of us in that moment, suspended in time, caught between family and something far more dangerous. The words he'd spoken hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and I struggled to breathe as my heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what to say, how to respond. It was as if the ground had split open beneath us, leaving us dangling in this strange, uncertain space where family and love collided in the most jarring of ways. My mind screamed at me to retreat, to remind him that this was wrong, that we were family. This was a boundary we couldn't cross, not without destroying everything we'd built. But the moment he touched my hand again, gently pulling my palm against his chest, I could feel his heart racing, mirroring my own. It was an intimacy that I couldn't deny, one that bypassed logic and settled straight into the deepest parts of my being. "Em," he whispered again, his voice softer now, more desperate, "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what to do with these feelings anymore." There was a rawness to his words that cracked something deep inside me, something I had kept hidden for years. A part of me had always known there was something more between us, something unspoken, lingering in the spaces between our conversations, in the way we looked at each other when no one else was paying attention. But we'd always ignored it, convinced ourselves it was nothing more than the bond of family, the shared history that tied us together. Until now. Suddenly, the weight of the situation crashed down on me. This wasn't just about Marcus and me anymore. It wasn't just about a fleeting moment or a passing attraction. This was something profound, something that had always been there, buried beneath years of denial and guilt. I could see it in the way his eyes held mine, how every word, every movement, every breath seemed to speak of an unspoken truth. My pulse quickened as I realized that I had been carrying these feelings for him for far too long, trying to push them down to pretend they weren't there. But now that they were exposed, there was no going back. I opened my mouth, but the words didn't come. How could they? How could I possibly make sense of this, of the tangled web we were now in? My hand was still in his, and when he gently tugged me closer, the space between us shrinking until there was barely room to breathe, my thoughts scattered, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. Without thinking, I leaned in, my lips brushing against his cheek in a kiss that was as much a question as it was a confession. He turned his head, and for the briefest moment, our lips met. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but one filled with an aching tenderness, as if both of us were silently asking for forgiveness, for understanding, for something we couldn't name. When we pulled apart, there was no going back. The world outside still churned with uncertainty, but in that moment, everything was clear. We couldn't stop this. We couldn't ignore what had always been there, waiting for the right moment to surface. And as we looked at each other, the unspoken truth hung in the air like a fragile promise. This was just the beginning. The aftermath of that kiss felt like the slow unraveling of a life I'd once known, and yet, in a way, it was freeing. It wasn't as simple as just giving in to a moment of desire or confusion. It was the weight of years spent locked in silence, of unspoken truths, finally coming to light. But with that clarity came a flood of guilt. What would our family say? What would Aunt Carol think when she woke up, when the dust settled? In the sterile, fluorescent glow of the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the hum of machines and the distant sound of hurried footsteps, Marcus and I stood at the edge of something impossible. We knew we couldn't go back to how things were, not after what had just happened. But what did that even mean for us, for the rest of our lives? The kiss had opened a door, but beyond it lay a path neither of us knew how to walk. We spent the next few days at the hospital in a haze, not speaking of what had passed between us, but the air between us was thick with understanding. It was as if everything had changed, even though nothing had been said. Aunt Carol eventually recovered, her surgery a success, and the family slowly returned to their usual rhythm. But Marcus and I found ourselves slipping into the shadows, avoiding the crowded rooms, avoiding each other's eyes. It felt like we were walking on the edge of a precipice, teetering between what we had been and what we had become. But no matter how much we tried to hide from it, the bond between us was undeniable. It was stronger now, somehow more fragile, more real. The weight of what we'd shared couldn't be erased, not by time, not by distance. One evening, nearly a week later, I found myself sitting alone in the same living room where it had all begun, where the kiss had shifted everything. Marcus entered quietly, as if he were trying to avoid drawing attention to himself, but he didn't leave. Instead, he sat beside me, his presence a comfort and a challenge all at once. "I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted softly, his voice rough, as though admitting it aloud made the feelings real. "About us, about what happened." My heart raced at his words, not from shock, but from the quiet realization that he, too, had been living in the same fog of uncertainty and longing. He reached for my hand again, this time not with hesitation, but with certainty. "We can't go back, Em, but we don't have to know exactly where this is going. All I know is that whatever this is, it's real, and I can't walk away from it." I looked into his eyes and saw the same fear, the same desire that I felt, this shared vulnerability, this uncharted territory. There was no roadmap for what we were about to do, but in that moment I understood one thing. Love doesn't always follow the paths we expect it to. Sometimes it finds us in the most unexpected places, at the most unexpected times. And sometimes, love is found not in the clean, neat boxes of convention, but in the messy, complicated corners of our hearts where we've been afraid to look. As Marcus held my hand, I realized that this love, however complicated, however taboo, was ours. And for the first time, I didn't need to understand it. I just needed to let it be.